Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily from the Students' Union here at City University. I'm not going to do the talking because they're going to do some talking, hopefully from questions from you. A quick introduction. We have a program rep from the School of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences, Danny. We have Emma, who's our school representation officer for the School of Health Sciences. And we have James, who is currently the SRO for Arts, but will be Vice President Education as of the 1st of August. They'll give a brief introduction to what they do, and we'll each think of a good and perhaps not so good example of assessment and feedback, and then it's over to you. So think of any questions, feel free to ask any questions. They're very vocal and very happy to answer your questions. So I'll hand over to Danny first, or I don't know if they work. Do they work?
Yeah. I'm Daniel. I'm studying air transport operations and management. I'm in my final year now. I'd say an example of good feedback would be balance. So it starts with something positive about your work, maybe then something negative or something that you could have improved on, and then finally finishing off with something positive again, just so you feel a bit happier about it. Negative feedback, I'd say, would be quite non-constructive and non-directional. So something that we receive that says maybe you're missing something but doesn't indicate exactly where you're going to miss that from.
I'm just finished my 4th year studying speech and language therapy. Example of good feedback we have is one that addresses the assessment criteria, so it takes every section of the assessment criteria and says whether or not you addressed it well. Some bad feedback we had would be similar to Danny's, so just saying you didn't do this well and not saying why you didn't do it very well.
So yeah, I'm James. I'm just finishing off my 3rd year of a music degree. An example of good feedback is people I talk to tend to find that actually things that help you stylistically with essays, because ultimately most of us will hope to never write the same essay twice. So you want something that's actually going to improve your style as someone who writes, instead of something that just says you should have done this on this essay. It's helpful to know what you've missed, but it's also helpful to know that the next essay you do on something unrelated, you can actually improve your style, so it's going to benefit your overall degree, not just one module, one essay. Negative feedback, students I've spoken to have tended to find as feedback that goes against what you've been told in the lead up to submission. So typically, you've been told to do this, to put this in, or possibly focus on this, and then when you get your feedback and you're reading through and they criticise you for putting in that and this, and you sit there scratching your head thinking, why? But you told me this was A stuff, and it was not. So lecturers, don't lie to us, is the moral of that story.
We've just been joined by Julio as well, who's also currently a program rep and will be president of the Students' Union as of the 1st of August. If you briefly want to introduce yourself and give a good and not so good example of assessment and feedback.
I think luckily you introduced me for me, so thanks for that. An example of positive feedback would be whereby you get given feedback for a piece of work that you can then use it as sort of a model example for your actual final exam. So good feedback would be being able to look back on your coursework feedback and thinking, okay, I know exactly what I did wrong here to do well, to learn on what I haven't done well, and then apply that to my exam, to my final exam. An example of negative feedback would be feedback that's sort of incomplete and not cohesive and not detailed enough, and also very late feedback isn't always great either, because the coursework tends not to be in your head as much. So that's what I'm going to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
You're focusing rather heavily on assessment feedback. What about other types of feedback, for example, in seminars and things like that? How useful is that for you?
I'd say it's quite useful. I mean, in my course we have a lot of different styles of assessment. We're assessed on our placement performance and things like that. So the best kind of feedback from that is when we get observed doing what we're doing. We have a sort of set of criteria that will structure the observation, and then we can talk through it afterwards, or we can watch a video together of me doing therapy or of a client, and then we can talk through what went well and what didn't. I think one-to-one meetings are kind of really good at making you improve what you're doing. I think that's probably the best thing that we're able to do.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point you hit upon, because I think my own school, arts, our NSS stats for assessment and feedback last year weren't as high, I think, as anyone really wanted them to have been. I think part of this is that students don't really understand that things like seminars and workshops and things do count as part of this feedback, and actually I think the communication problem there is that students aren't appreciating the full scope of what we're offering, or lectures are offering to students. The course I've been doing, music, I have one-to-one tutorials with lecturers. I've got personal tutors, and we're in constant communication. That's always going to be feedback. I think one way we can tackle things like low NSS is to actually explain to students right from the off. This isn't just giving you a sheet after you've handed in things for submission. It's letting you know that I'm going to be talking to you throughout the course of the year, and if there's things you need, I'll be supporting you. And I think once we redress that balance, assessments such as workshops will become much more important to students, because it is so helpful to get immediate response, or to make students appreciate that the immediate response they're getting is actually feedback, as well as, you know, being twinned with assessment right there.
Yeah, for my course, we don't really have many seminars or workshops, but for this year we had individual project, and for that I've had weekly meetings with my tutor for that, and I think it was the best way of learning, because there's only so many documents you can send him at one point and he can write a few notes, but if you sit down for an hour and you go through it, I think that non-written feedback, that you actually sit and work through every different aspect of what you're giving him, is probably one of the most useful things I've had this year.
Personal interaction is important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'd say personal interaction is probably important throughout the entire degree. It's obviously really helpful and really quite needed in the final year, but if that could be sort of if it could be more regular across all schools, whereby one-to-ones, seminars and workshops were sort of the norm, then I think we'd be getting somewhere where we want to be.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have any questions?
Not me, sorry, I was pointing. I was pointing to the lady, sorry.
Thank you. How do you feel about the feedback within 3 weeks thing? Is that quick enough or too slow? And do you appreciate the staff side of that as well as the student side of that? It's just a question about whether we're getting it right with the 3-week thing or not, and whether you think there's any alternative.
I mean, if I can start on this one, I've sat in quite a few staff-student liaison committee meetings where staff members have commented that students have given the feedback, given their courseworks in a minute before the deadline, 10 minutes before the deadline, and then I've had that same staff member give the feedback the day after 3 weeks. And I think there needs to be more regularity over staff giving the feedback back in time. I've waited 2 months, for a piece of work that we were given back the day before the exam. And it is very useful to have your feedback in 3 weeks, because you know when you're going to get it and you can structure your revision around it. And I think it needs to be kind of more heavily enforced, because we all meet our deadlines. And I think staff then making comments about you handing it in maybe a minute before it's due and then giving it you back 4 weeks or 5 weeks after isn't necessarily the best thing, the best example to set towards the students. But I do really appreciate that, you know, even with big projects, they're given back 3 weeks, and if they're not, a lot of my staff members and lecturers will turn around and say, I've not been able to do this because I've had to go to a conference, and they'll explain the situation to us. And I think that's quite important. A lot of communication is very important with it.
Right, I would say in terms of feedback, I find that the 3-week deadline seems to apply to sort of generic feedback as well. So what we've had a lot from informatics is that we would get generic feedback within 3 weeks on the exam as a whole for all students, but individual feedback would be longer, and I think it just feels like it doesn't really live up to its name, because 3-week feedback, you expect your coursework, your individual coursework, to be marked within 3 weeks, and that definitely hasn't happened in School of Informatics anyway.
I think it's been helpful to know. I think students have found, you know, having this 3, some things I think like big projects are 4 weeks. It's good, useful to know what that is, but I think part of the difficulty is kind of, again, it's miscommunication. I think students not understanding if that's 3 working weeks or 3 full weeks, so 21 days or 15 working days, or and then you've got to account for bank holidays and things. I mean, I think I've benefited in my department, luckily, from having administrative staff who will let you know when you're expecting feedback, if there are, you know, the bank holidays last week kind of jiggled times and things, for instance. But I also think it's difficult across schools. The more I talk to students, the more you realise, you know, I've spent the last 3 years in lectures with maybe between 20 and 30 students. Some of them were 50. But then you compare it to other lectures where you've got hundreds of students, and to expect actually departments to meet the same numbers when you've got maybe 10 students in one module for a 3-week turnaround and 200 in another, I think it's in some ways it's quite, well, not saying in some ways, it's quite unreasonable to expect that to lecturers. The problem is how to manage that, and I'm not quite sure that there's an easy solution, because you could say, well, actually some schools and departments should have feedback times based on class sizes, but it's difficult. I think the only way to manage these things is to actually talk to students, because once the turnaround time and the workload is kind of impressed. I mean, I spoke to a couple of lecturers who had multiple modules to be handing in and turning around. So if you're first marking one lot of 60 essays and then you're also doing another module of 60 and you're expected to get that both done, it's putting increased pressure upon the staff. And I think there has to be some sort of conversation going on between staff and students to explain actually the difficulties there, because all it does is create tension, and the last thing we need, especially going into next year, is tension between staff and students. So
I'd say that 3 weeks is a good time, but I understand that there's issues with that sometimes, and the most helpful thing with that is to just let students know if you're not going to meet 3 weeks. I don't think students necessarily mind if you're going to be a week late, as long as you've told them, so that at 3 weeks they're not sitting there thinking, when am I going to get my marks back? Just, I think keeping students in the loop of when you think you'll get stuff back makes them happier than sitting there expecting 3 weeks.
I do agree with James on that point about maybe tailoring it to class size, because the cohort on my course is 6 students, so that's not a lot, and that's all I share my classes with, so we get very close and we know each other very well. And I don't think it's fair that my lecturer teaches another module of 50 students and he should be expected to turn that round in exactly the same time frame as he turns ours round. So maybe restructuring that slightly to take into account lecturer workload as well. I know in SEMS a lot of staff go off to conferences and they're all throughout the year, and they might be busy one week, so it's unfair to expect them to maybe fill everybody's feedback in, but then just let everybody know, because no one will be upset about it, because we just want to be able to plan how to structure our revision and everything around all of that feedback.
Thank you. I saw some other hands up earlier. Yeah.
I was just wondering in general how confident students are around what their expectations are about what assessment feedback they're going to get, and where they raise their concerns if they're not getting that feedback as they would have expected to.
I think one of the problems I've found, again, just talking to students, is actually consistency. What one lecturer will give you in terms of feedback will be completely different to what another lecturer will give you. And so you have this constant battle between lecturers giving you different amounts of feedback and kind of assessment feedback, and different students wanting different amounts of feedback. I think one-to-one meetings and tuition and office hours and things, I think, become really important in that sense, because we need to keep open these channels where students who feel they need more can go to lecturers, and also lecturers who want to give more should feel free to do so. I think the more feedback we can be giving personally, the better, because if a student doesn't want to read something, they can just not look at the piece of paper. But if they're looking at a piece of paper that's looking pretty blank, they're going to get frustrated if they're wanting more. I think we've just got to be really kind of clear about what we're doing, and actually kind of supporting people in being able to access information.
I'd say my department's quite good at letting you know what feedback you're going to get when you are given the assessment. So I think they are quite good at giving you the assessment criteria, and they quite consistently will address that in their feedback. When we do have issues with feedback, we have quite good program reps who are able to raise that, and more often than not the staff will just give those students more feedback, or I think students are quite happy to meet staff to talk over their assessments.
I actually had a discussion about this last week with my head of department, and I think students should be given assessment criteria to a certain point, because you don't want to just hand them everything that they need to do, because they'll just do everything that they need to do and nothing more. I think there needs to be guidance rather than you must show understanding of this, because that's the bare minimum, and I think a lot of students would just do the bare minimum. I think there really does need to be guidance and discussions. I think face-to-face communication in lectures about the coursework that they're giving you, to spend maybe half an hour at the end of the lecture discussing what outcomes they want you to gain from it. And yeah, just kind of like more communication rather than just a piece of paper handed to you, I think would be a lot better. And we would raise it at the student liaison committee if feedback has been bad. If it was a single case, we'd tell them to go directly to the lecturer, but if it's on the whole, we'd raise it at the board.
I would say overall, feedback in informatics has been a bit patchy, and a lot of students have asked for more positive and more sort of constructive feedback, because I think just because of the nature of the course, if you're making a program, your code is either right or it's just wrong. If it's wrong, it won't work. So rather than getting some feedback saying this part of the code doesn't work, that doesn't work, perhaps some sort of explanation or just sort of way to say why it was wrong. That's what we don't get a lot of in the School of Informatics, but I understand that it's also the nature of the course itself as well. Going on, just following on from what Danny said in terms of guidance and discussion, informatics students sort of need a specific, your program needs to do this, this, and this, this, and this. So that wouldn't apply to informatics, but I totally see what you're saying.
I think Danny hit upon an interesting point, actually. I think what we need to remember with guidelines and things is that I think the more rules you put in place, the more students will tend to adhere to them. Because I think if you give someone a massive script of things that they must do, then it becomes a ticking off exercise. It's jumping through hoops and it's A-levels. Sorry, I mentioned the bad A word again. But what we need to remember is that the guidelines should be there to actually allow a student to kind of flourish within something. I know it sounds a bit flowery to say so, but writing a submission, doing an assessment should be something that allows you to put an element of individuality into something. And I think giving somebody the right amount of information that lets them know exactly what they need to do without telling them how to do it allows a student to put themselves into a piece of work, and actually gives them a bit of ownership of what they're doing. So it's not just an exercise, it's actually you're contributing to your degree and then into your future. I think it's massively important that we be working on how to best deal with that.
The courseworks I found the most interesting, I know it doesn't apply to every school, but because of my course, we've been able to do critical analysis-based courseworks, and that really allows you, I mean, that specific lecturer spent a lot of time communicating with us about the coursework and what he expects, but it's more show that you understand something, but how can you apply this to the real world, and how can you apply this to a debate if you were in that situation? And I think that's the best way of learning, because when you get into an exam, often it is a discussion question, and to have that extra bump to make you go out and do some more research about maybe how the UK government feels compared to the US government, it gives you a lot better understanding and a lot broader understanding for future employment as well.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have any questions?
Thank you. I'll let you off straight away by saying I don't come from City, so what feedback would you give my colleagues who say, and it's a typically cynical response, I appreciate, but I think it's certainly one that I hear. What's the point in giving feedback? They never read it. Bearing in mind your initial response about the need for feedback being constructive, what would you say to break down that barrier that we have?
Is the barrier you're saying that what, actually, I'm not sure what exactly your point is. Sorry.
That's reasonable feedback. The question I have is I have a series of academics who I work with, and one of the questions they'll say is, I spend a long time providing feedback, and then I'm convinced that the students will see 62, that'll do, put it to the side, and ignore the feedback that I've spent a long time putting forward. Now, I don't believe that's always true, but I'm convinced that there is a need to break down that cynical view, and I wonder how we can do that and how we can use the students to encourage staff to realise that you do use that feedback so that it is a worthy thing to actually undertake.
Okay, well, one thing I'll say instantly to that is a lot of students rely, certainly in informatics, on their coursework feedback on what they need to do for their final exam, because in a lot of the cases, part of the coursework, there'll be a very similar question in the final exam usually. So it's in your own interest to make sure you go through the feedback and understand where you've gone wrong so that you can improve on that for your final exam.
I think my immediate response to people saying, well, what's the point, is that actually it's wrong to underestimate how interested students are in their own degrees. And I think you're better catering to the most interested end, who want to know as much as possible, than you are dealing with students who just want to see a number. I mean, I've been a mixture. It's depended on the essay, and my own department are very clever at putting the number on the bottom of the feedback sheet, which inevitably means turning over a piece of paper anyway. So so they're trying to encourage us to read it whatever we want. I think another part of the issue is that lecturers should be giving as much feedback as they like, because if we were just getting a number, the problem is that if lecturers are thinking that students are just looking at numbers, I can almost guarantee students are feeling that lecturers are just looking at essays and going and feeling like you're not marking my piece of work, you're marking one of 60, and I think it's almost an alienation of what you're doing. I think you've got to place importance upon every single piece of assessment because it counts, because you've paid for it. Especially next year, students are going to feel like they've paid for work on whatever level. So feedback has to be something that you give, because actually, if you disagree with something 6 months down the line, and a lecturer has then as a support structure and says, well, actually, I did tell you in 3 or 4 paragraphs here what I thought, and I can easily email it to you again, and it speeds up a conversation that maybe needs to be had if a student isn't happy with the work later down the line. And I think also it means that students just have as much information as possible. We need to be talking to people. We need to be giving them as much as we can, because if we don't, then we're all going to suffer for it later, because students will feel aggrieved and lecturers will feel like they're getting hard done by, and it's not helpful or conducive to a good kind of academic culture.
Okay. I would say it depends on the assessment then. I think the situations where students might not read feedback is if they've had an assessment that they think is completely irrelevant to everything they're going to do in the future. If your assessment is applicable to your exams or your future career or anything like that, then of course the students are going to read the feedback. If it's just something that they think is irrelevant and something they're doing just to pass their degree, then they probably won't read their feedback. So I think it's making sure the assessment is addressing what the students are there for.
In my first year, I wasn't as keen on feedback as I was in second and third. I think I was like every first year student. You know, you look at your grade, and if you've done well, you call your mum and you tell her you've done well, and she's happy with you, and you kind of leave it at that. But come second and third year, you really do start to care about what that number means, rather than just that number is 60, 70. You really care about how you can do better, because come the exams, like Julia said, the questions are representative of what you've been studying the whole year. And I know that it's the other way around. In this department, there's quite a few staff members that really do care about how we think they're teaching. And I know one that made it online that you couldn't actually see your grade until you'd given him feedback, which was quite a clever way of him getting us to spend 5 minutes just writing about what we thought about his lecture style. But maybe doing something like that, if feedback was given back to students as all the words first, followed by the number, they might actually, some students will just click continue, but some will read it because they'll think the number's at the end. And they'll get into that process where they start to actually care about where they've gone wrong, what they could have done better next time. Because, I mean, for my modules, we had 2 courseworks per module for some of them. So it really did matter what you did wrong in the first one to apply it to the second.
Hello. I just wondered, with your coursework, is it all is it anonymous, or do you have your names on it?
We have our names on it, and that's something I've been pushing for about 8 to 9 months now, since this year, is that if you don't do well on a piece of coursework and you get a bad grade and you complain about it, I think it gets very difficult. I know from first, second and third year of my degree, a lot of students are scared to go and ask their lecturer for feedback, for further feedback, because they don't want the lecturer to start not liking them and marking it personally. And I think using processes like Turnitin and having it as anonymous would be a fantastic way of getting really representative feedback. I can't say whether lecturers are or aren't marking personally, but I think it would be a lot better if it was anonymous.
Okay, what do the others do you think?
In my department, everything is anonymous, but we also don't have online submission. So I think through Moodle, I don't think there is a way of making it anonymous. I think that's something that our school had a problem with. But yeah, we do everything anonymously, and I think it makes students just feel a bit more secure about their marks.
So when you get your feedback, do you get it on paper? You don't get it through Moodle?
No, yeah, get everything on paper still. I think
right, because it's interesting what you were saying about the mark, because the way Moodle is leading us, if you like, if we give feedback through Moodle, is that there's a grade and then there's a text thing. So it makes it much easier to just look at the mark. So I was just interested to see your response. So are you all just still getting yours by paper?
Personally, I get a mix. Lecturers will sometimes email PDF copies of what you are getting a printout sheet anyway, so those who want to know what the mark as soon as it's released can get it. I must admit, I find it quite a strange transition we're still going through, because things should either be completely on Moodle at this stage or not on Moodle at all. I think consistency, again, to kind of hammer it in, has to be what we're doing, because it gets frustrating having to check emails or check Moodle or going to the office, having to kind of bandy around all these different options to get. You just want one place to go and pick up something, and if that's Moodle, fine, but we need to make sure it is. I mean, I tend to go to the office and pick up paper just because of the nature of the modules I've been doing, and some lecturers are more inclined or less inclined to use Moodle, depending on their technological persuasion, as I'm sure some of you are aware. So it's an odd mix. I quite like paper. I'm a bit old-fashioned, although I guess having a printed out piece of paper isn't that old-fashioned unless it was written with a feather and ink. But we just need consistency.
So your feedback isn't anonymous then?
The difficulty is, on my course at least, we tend to be quite tutored, as in, if you choose an essay question, you'll have an initial tutor session on which we'll discuss. So even if it is blind marked, which I can't, Chris, are we blind marked? Exams are blind marked. Thank you. Sorry, it's helpful because my undergrad director's right there. No pressure on that one, by the way. So lecturers, even if they were blind marking, I guess would have an indication of what you're writing. But I think in some ways that's useful. I'm quite comfortable with the idea that a lecturer has understood my process going into an essay, because I think that helps them understand where I've come from. Although at the same time it does kind of mean that they're reading between the lines, which possibly they shouldn't be on an assessment. So I think blind marking in some ways would be really useful, but there will always be dangers in courses where there's more support. Fantastic to have more support, but lecturers will always know or be able to figure out who it is, I think, in smaller class sizes.
Yeah, with my class size, it's very difficult when 6 of you have been taught by 4 lecturers for 3 years. They know your writing style by now, so there's no easy way of really changing it or making it anonymous. But I think with your point about Moodle, some of my lecturers use Moodle fully. Some of them prefer to print out and hand it to you, depending on what the coursework is. And then some are kind of in that weird transition where they attach a document to Moodle but don't actually use the feedback boxes. So they'll just fill it in on a document and send that to you. And I think there does need to be consistency in the way the feedback's received. I know one lecturer really likes Turnitin, and every student has responded really positively to that because he can highlight the paragraph that he wants to make a comment on and make a good or bad comment, and it comes up highlighted areas on your original document with the grade and the general feedback on the side. So it kind of draws you into wanting to click and see, well, what was good in there, what was bad in there, as opposed to just having a blank Moodle box that just says 60% very good, could have done better on this. It's a nicer interface to use.
Thank you. Who had their hand up on the other side?
Don't worry, it's an easy one.
Sure.
I'm not sure how many of you this applies to, but in group coursework, would you rather pick the group you work with or have them assigned, and why?
I'm currently undertaking the second group project this year in which we weren't allowed to choose who we work with. Now, I was placed with 2 students that, I've just submitted a 16,000 page document, and between the 2 of them, they did about 2,000 words. And it's very difficult to get people onto the same level as you. I know from first year, I worked with 2 students that were dedicated, wanted to do well, and I much prefer the idea of being able to choose who you work with, because I know 60% of that grade is allocated individually, but I'm still relying 40% on 2 people on basically my degree at this stage. And I know that lecturers have often responded saying, well, you don't get to choose who you work with in the real world, but you're paid to do that. Whereas in university, we're paying for something. So, if your boss wants you to do something and work with someone you don't particularly like, you do it, because if the other person doesn't, they get fired and you don't. But in university, it could be the difference between a 2-2 and a first. And I think it really is important to give students that option. Not to allow, there has to maybe be some sort of structure to not allow students to just kind of pair off with someone that they know is always doing the work, because there will always be 1 or 2 students that don't want to do anything and will try and tag on to someone that does it all. But I think, again, 100% of the mark or 90% of the mark should maybe be allocated individually, with 10% to how you worked as a group rather than 60-40. Because for me, that weighting is the same as my dissertation weighting. So it's a very significant proportion of my course that's relying on 2 people that I have experienced haven't done any work. So a bit more passionate about that one.
I think psychologists... sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I completely agree with what Danny's saying. I think if there was some scope to allow students to choose who they worked with, I think that is definitely a positive thing, because you end up getting a lot of resentment from, like Dan was saying, with people who end up not working well with the group they've been auto-allocated. So I think if there was perhaps a sort of mixture between 2, if there was some online system where you would decide who you want to work with, pick them, and then there'd be an auto-allocation for those who haven't been assigned partners. I think that'd probably be the best thing.
I suffer from this thing called only child syndrome. So I would always argue that group work should be something that should be encouraged around things but never assessed, because actually some people just naturally work better on their own. And I know I found this to be the case. The one piece of work I did do that was group work was back in my first term, and I remember getting incredibly frustrated because we didn't talk to each other. And so I can tell you this now because, it's 2 years later. The only conversation we had was the day before hand-in, where we all sat down, copied everything into the same Word document and printed it out and put all our names on it. As it happens, we did all right, and that's fine. But I think the flip side of this is that actually group work can really encourage people to do well. I know that there are people that I'd like to work with, and allowing that is fine. But I think also the onus should possibly be on lecturers to see who could bring out the best in other people. I think if we're going to plan, we need to be really lecturers, I think, should be really purposeful in who they put people with, because actually, if we can be encouraging people to bring their differences to different groups, you can actually have an incredible group of people doing a piece of work they can be proud of. Now, I'm honestly not sure if group work is the best way to go on a degree that ultimately comes out for you, and I think many of the problems that Danny suggested coming out are issues and kind of worries that a lot of students have. And I think actually possibly the best way would be to allow students to have kind of individual assessment throughout, but also offer opportunities for group work and sessions and things as kind of maybe like pastoral support around the degree, so actually opportunities to work in groups in lectures. So you still get the group work things, you still get the discussion, you still maybe get your little presentations, but the assessment of it, I think, is really dangerous, because as soon as you start relying upon other people, I think, you know, there's a module in the year below me that students have just completed, and they found it really difficult, because actually the bigger the group gets, the harder it is to get everyone working on the same page at the same time and in the same place. Because, you know, we've got to remember that students can't always be accessible if they're living in halls, or if they're living at home, or if they're living in private accommodation. You know, London might be our campus, but it's pretty huge. So getting everyone together at the same time is pretty difficult. So I think to be able to manage group work effectively, you've either got to be really careful about managing it, and actually lecturers have a responsibility to manage group work, and actually I don't think enough is being done across the board to support that, because all I hear is students saying, well, actually I did this group project, but it was me and Joe Bloggs over there doing everything, whilst you know, John Smith did nothing at all. So we've got to be really responsible, I think, in group work and things.
Oh, I was just going to disagree with everyone and say that, yeah, I prefer working with it being assigned. We do a lot of group work in speech therapy, I think, just to, as Danny said, it's to prepare us for the real world. And ultimately, when you're out there being a speech therapist, you don't get to choose the other speech therapists you're working with, but you do work with other speech therapists, you do work with teachers, and you might not always get on, and you might not always have the same opinions on everything, but ultimately you have to work with them. So I think it teaches you skills. Not working with your friends teaches you more skills than working with your friends. But what we do is we have a system where we rate each other on their contribution to the coursework. So there's like a set of different 4 criteria, and you rate each other out of 6. So if we are in the position where one person hasn't contributed anything, their mark can reflect that, but they can also rate themselves and say, well, I did give that. I mean, that has caused some issues, but I think it's a fairer way of making up for people who don't contribute. But yeah, I am a fan of working with whoever you're given.
I don't mind that as long...
Pardon?
It's very, very effective, that form of peer.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't mind working with people that I've been allocated, so long as I know that my grade isn't reliant on what they're doing, because when I sit in an interview, if I've not done well on that module, the interviewee is not going to care whether Joe Bloggs didn't do any work on it, because it's my degree classification at the end of the day. And I don't mind, yes, it does teach me a lot of skills. I've learnt a lot specifically with this second group project. But at the same time, if it was chosen in a way that this one was random number generator, you were all given a number and that was it. But I know through my first group project that there's a girl on my course that what she does very well in, I don't do so well in, and vice versa. I've always done quite well in some of maybe the non-engineering side things, and she's done well in it. And I think pairing people together for a project, because you as lecturers and professors will know exactly what skills are needed. I know that working with her, she covered a lot that I would never have understood and been done very well on, and I learned from that. And I think it is a learning curve. It's not just to fill in a project and do well on it. You need to learn from it and take something away. And if lecturers, for my projects, they're in 3rd year, so they know exactly who does well at what. So pairing it in that way, I think, will be a lot better. Really, like James said, complementing each other's work.
Right, go for our last question.
Mine's not a question. I just wanted to sort of make an addition and agree with the lady discussant that not being able to choose who you work with, I think is consistent with the broader aims of education. I think education is not just to attain good grades and flying colors and you go out there. I think education has broad objectives that include even being able to learn how to relate with people, being able to manage people, because you said out there, someone doesn't work well, can be fired and so on, but you inculcate that at school, being able to manage your group so that when you go out there, you don't find a shock of your life and so on and so forth. Even if you excel at school, you can actually get fired at the place of work if you have not picked a few qualities, a few skills at school. So I think we need to appreciate education to have broad objectives that transcend academic performance.
Cool. Amish, I'll let you.
Amish Patel, resident heckler. Given that you're all final years, it'd be quite interesting to know, taking into account all the assessments you've had over the duration of your degree, how much confidence has that given you, and do you feel it's equipped you well enough with the skills to go into the industries you plan to go into?
I would say yes. In my coursework, we've got courseworks, group works. We watch videos of ourselves doing therapy. We're assessed on performance of placement. We have courseworks based on writing a report or writing a referral, anything you would do in the real speech therapy world. So I think our range of assessments is set up so that we're qualified and we're equipped to do everything a speech therapist would do in their first year in a job. And we're assessed on that, so we know what we're really good at, what we need to improve, maybe what would be our aim to work on in our first year in our jobs. But I think being assessed on placement and watching videos back of yourself doing therapy with a lecturer is probably the most effective in showing you how good a therapist you'll become.
I'm going to say that, yeah, I mean, I've just completed a music degree. And honestly, my career aspirations at this stage in my degree are completely different to the ones I had in first year. And so actually it's really difficult to answer that question with any kind of solid answer because, I initially came to university wanting to be a musicologist, and I wanted to write essays for a living. Don't ask me why. I have since changed that opinion. I went through several various iterations, and now I think I want to be, I think I ultimately want to be writing music for a living. God help you all. But I think the main thing for me about coming to university overall was to challenge myself. I think university is as much a personal challenge as it is a step on your way to any career. And the beauty of a degree, I think, is that it opens you up to many different opportunities. Many people, I think, have the same experience as I have and find that you won't leave university going and doing exactly the thing you thought you were going to be doing 3 years before. And that's exciting. And I think the onus is therefore not to try and assess people in such ways it gives them towards one degree, because the last thing university at this stage should be doing is limiting you, because actually, as we're finding, graduates don't have the same opportunities they had maybe 5-10 years ago, and we need to make sure that a degree can leave you with as much breadth as possible, because if you want to specialise in something, then there are opportunities in your degree, but you also need to have many different things, and I've benefited from having that. So long story short, yes and no, I think is the answer to your question.
I think through my degree, because the aviation industry is so wide and incorporates all different elements, the way that our courseworks have been structured, it's very much put yourself in the situation of a manager of a new airline and write how you would implement this regulation or that system. And then as well, we've done engineering, drawing and design in the first year, so you can get, if you were ever sat at a position that you needed to understand engineering drawings, you've got that element. And we've done aircraft balance sheets, so if you're ever in an operational department, you understand what they mean and how to fill those in. And I think it is important to give kind of examples of what you'd be doing in the real world, rather than just, this is what it is, this is what it means, go off, that's it. Because now I'm looking for jobs, I've got to that wonderful stage of sitting on job websites for hours on end. A lot of the job descriptions say you must have an understanding of how such and such a regulation has been implemented in the past year. And I find that the course has been changed quite a lot because of all the new developments in the industry. And I think that's really important to keep up to date with what's going on outside of the university bubble, because you're not going to be in this in 6 months' time, and you're going to need to be in a real job, getting paid to do something that you need to understand. And I think that's really, really important. So yes.
In short, yes. And that's because in the School of Informatics, so for example, my degree, Business Computer Systems, you learn how to program in Java, CSS, HTML, and those are exactly the kinds of things that employers are looking for, whether you want to go for a sort of programming job. But what I would say, expanding on what Dan said, is that if parts of the curriculum could link into sort of the real world. So if we could bring more topical discussion into the curriculum, that would probably not only engage students a bit more, but make sure that they have you know, things topical to discuss at the interview, and also develop an understanding of the industry itself, rather than just the nitty-gritty work they need to do.
Just to note, I don't think the university's not in the real world. It's just that it's more like, I think it's the structure in university. You're never going to have that structure of being given a coursework deadline in the real world. In your job, you'll be told you need to do this and when to do it by. And I think that's where university helps you set yourself up for that, because your employer's never going to give you all the documentation that you need and all the sources that you need. You're expected to go out and not look on Wikipedia to get your answer. You're expected to go and properly reference everything that you provide to your employer. And I think that's what's important to stress to people in feedback, is that you might, well, for my course, you might be doing this in 6 months' time every day for an airline, and you need to understand exactly what you've done and if you've gone wrong somewhere, where that is, because you don't want to just leave university thinking, I didn't do so well, but I can apply for the job, blag a bit in the interview, get it, and then sit there and do something incorrectly. You want to know how to improve and how to excel in it. And I think that's why feedback, I know like we're in a feedback conference, but feedback is the most important thing, I think, throughout my whole time at university, from every single type, being it in sat down and having a chat with your lecturer or getting it on a piece of paper. I think it is genuinely the most important thing that I've had.
Thanks very much. We have time just for one quick question, and that's on.
Thank you. Amish actually quite touched upon my question a little bit. My question is, you get feedback on assessments throughout the year, but what is your relationship with your personal tutors in terms of the feedback that you get when you're not handing in coursework? Is there encouragement? Would you have wanted more encouragement? And I don't know if it would apply to you, James. I know Danny was mentioning his dissertation, and Emma and Julio, but or Julia rather. What has the feedback been in terms of your dissertation? Because the dissertation can be something that takes over half of your sort of academic course in your final year. And do you feel that the feedback and the support that you got when you were leading up to handing it in was sufficient? And was the feedback, if you've received it by now, the feedback on what you handed in, like 10,000, 20,000 words, was that sufficient? And so it is really sort of picking up on, touching on Amish's question as well. But yeah.
Okay, well, I'd say it would have been good to have more encouragement to meet with a personal tutor amongst 3 years. I think I can probably say that I've only met with my personal tutor about 4 times in the last 3 years. So it would be good to have more contact, and some students have mentioned that, certainly in informatics anyway. And I haven't handed in my dissertation yet, so I can't answer the second part of your question.
I've not had my final feedback from my dissertation because I'm presenting on it in an hour, so not too sure how that's going to go. But throughout all of the interim submissions and going and showing my work, my tutor on that has been fantastic, to the point that he'll ask how things are going outside of university as well, how you're balancing your workload. It's not just, is this your work? It's actually taking a care in how you are and how you're balancing your workload, because third year is stressful, and I know everyone says it is, but you don't realise until you get to it how much work you get at the end. And I probably underestimated what it would be like, and then ended up in the library till 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, trying to finish things off. But I think it is important to have that more encouragement, and because I mean I've got it, but for other students that might not, to have that there. But I mean it really shows the fact that I wrote my dissertation on like airline passenger handling and how it's changing, and my tutor said to me, oh, obviously you're very interested in this. I'm going to speak to an ex-graduate who currently works at an airline in Stansted, and I'm doing some work experience for them next week now. So it really wasn't him just reading and not caring. It was like, oh, you're really interested in this, and arrange some work experience for me, which I think is really going the extra mile to care about how the students are feeling.
So I rarely have met my personal tutor, but in my course we also have clinical tutors every year who come and visit us on placement, who we sit and talk through what we're doing on placement. So they've been very helpful in making sure that we're set up to do our jobs well. I think I've probably been the worst person to ever supervise for a dissertation, because I think I sent my supervisor 2 drafts of the whole thing, and she was very lovely and just gave me feedback on it over email. I think I met her twice. But I haven't got any feedback on it yet because I only got my marks back yesterday. But I hope there is some feedback coming from somewhere.
I did actually write a dissertation. Music students can do essays sometimes. It's not all fun and games. It's mostly fun and games, but it's not all fun and games. I found over the last 3 years, my personal tutor's sat here staring at me. So Chris, you might want to cover your ears for a second, actually. I have found that the personal tutor system in my department works fantastically, because tutors are there when you want them. We have to meet with them once a term, so I will have had 9 meetings with my tutor, which doesn't sound like it's a lot, but actually I've been able to access him whenever I want to. You know, he's always on the end of an email. I know we have a 48-hour guarantee of email returns, which is fantastic. Often it's sooner than that. In fact, pretty much 99% of the time it's much sooner than that. So it's been great. I found with my dissertation tutor, though, that actually this year he became sort of more of my personal tutor, and it's not that I don't like you. It's just that the relationship I had with him was that I was working on things, and I had to explain to him very early on that my working method was that I'm going to be doing all the research and things quite early on and getting all my work done, but I won't start writing it until about 2 months to go, and this is going to stress you out no end. So what I found with my dissertation tutor was that actually he was willing to accept the way I work and go, okay, you know how you work, I've seen you do it before, we can work like this, but you've got to promise me. And I think the way I got through my dissertation, minus the caffeine and the stress, was to actually just be completely honest. I think we've got to have a situation with staff where you feel you've got a working relationship that I think goes beyond just sitting and listening to them talk at you. My department's we've got a really good community, I think, which, considering there's 6.5 full-time members of staff and 200 students, you know, tops, it's quite difficult and actually quite rare, and I think it's something that other departments in the university can look to, and hopefully over the next 12 months I can talk to people about how that works and see what can be done, and having a relationship like that was so useful for work, and the personal tutor system is something that is key, because there was times when I had to go into an office, not on my proudest days, and say, look, I've got this problem. And if I hadn't have felt like I could do that, because I'm on my own in the city, my family are miles away, if I hadn't have had that, I think it would have been a really difficult 3 years. So personal tutor, great. Dissertation tutor, completely understanding. And if he sees this, I hope he gives me a good marks. Otherwise, I'll record a kind of a different version of what I just said.
I didn't actually have any meetings with a personal tutor in my first and second year. My dissertation tutor became my personal tutor, just through the nature of me seeing him every week and having a lot of email communication. And I think it is important to have that personal tutoring, because this year it's been very, very helpful to have someone to actually go and speak to, even if it's not about university work, just about general life. You want to feel comfortable being able to speak to someone in university. And just to add, Emma said you got your grade but not your feedback. Maybe for the gentleman that asked the question, maybe it'd be useful to give the feedback first and then the grade a week after. I'm thinking that way they might actually read it. And that
would probably stress me out.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I hope you'll join me in thanking Giulio, Danny, Emma, and James.